I want to thank those who contributed to the discussion on our eviction ban bill. And just to respond briefly to some of the points that were made, that particularly from the government and from the Rural Independents and one or two others, that we're not acknowledging that there are reasons why landlords are exiting the market. The reason why landlords are exiting the market is because house prices are at an all-time high and they are cashing in on all-time high prices. Is that just a general assertion? Well, let me give you an example. A young woman who is a mother of 2 children, who's been renting for the last 16 years, I got this email today. Her landlord owns multiple properties and she's been given a notice to quit because her landlord intends to sell those sites and all of the sites, so there's going to be a lot of people evicted because he owns a lot of properties because he wants to invest in building apartments. So they're all going to be sold because he can make more money from building apartments than leaving them where they currently are. So that mother and her 2 children and dozens of other people are facing homelessness. They approach the council. Is there any chance the tenant in situ purchase could be applied to these cases? The council say no. Too expensive. We're not doing it. So they will end up homeless, and many others, and that landlord will then invest in building apartments which in my area at the moment are currently being advertised at €2,700. Totally unaffordable for all the people affected by the housing crisis. In fact, what sort of income would you need in order to pay a rent of that sort? You'd need after-tax income just to pay the rent of about €30,000 after tax. That is not affordable by the people who are affected by the housing crisis. But that is what your housing policies are delivering, and your reliance on private development in order to solve the housing crisis. It doesn't solve it. It is precisely the reason why we have to do something to stop people going into homelessness at the moment who have done nothing wrong. And I want to emphasise, our bill specifically excludes antisocial behaviour from the protections that our bill proposes. If people are being antisocial, if they're in breach of their licensing arrangements, that's fair enough. It's as willful non-payment. Although I will say, if there are people who fall into arrears through no fault of their own, to cite another example I gave, and I gave it I think to the Taoiseach the other day, an elderly couple who were working, paying a rent of over €2,500 a month in a top-up arrangement on a HAP tenancy, but then the husband gets early onset Alzheimer's, is no longer getting an income, his wife is now her carer, they can't pay the rent. It's not their fault, they can't pay the rent. The government or the council will not allow a further increase in the HAP payment they get, so they are now in arrears. They're also in arrears for their heating bills. So are we going to throw out on the street an elderly man with early onset Alzheimer's and his caring wife? Are we? Will you bring that case? I certainly will. I certainly will. I certainly will. But by the way, on these cases, we have written to the ministers. Or Jackie and her family, who I've mentioned again and again, who I was in court with. Okay, yeah. But we have written successively on these cases to the ministers, and all we get is, what do you call them, just acknowledgements. That's what we get. We get acknowledgements, right? So will you extend the purchase in situ to people over the thresholds who can't afford the rent? Jackie and her husband, who were working, always paid their rent, did nothing wrong, with their kids. Since they got their first notice to quit, and they're not covered by your existing ban, and this is to the point you said about, our ban would be people who are validly evicted. Yes, they were validly evicted on grounds of sale, but they'd done nothing wrong. Do you know how many houses they've looked at? Apartments on Daft, on myhome.ie over the last year. 700. 700. Every single day, dozens of them, they're looking for places. The most recent one they looked at just before they walked into the court on Friday facing a judge and a landlord who was an owner of multiple properties seeking to evict them, €2,700 a month. Cheapest available. Totally unaffordable. This is a working man and his family working for a semi-state company. They can maybe pay $1,000. They said at a push they could pay $1,500. What are they supposed to do? They're not even entitled to HAP. Will you extend HAP to people in these situations? No. Computer says nah. That's what we get when it comes to people facing homelessness. Now, what I want from this government is a policy that says the default position is not to put people into homelessness. Yes, of course we'll take amendments on this. We'll look at particular circumstances. I met that landlady who is herself homeless coming back. Of course we want to accommodate people like that. But the default position is the state should do absolutely everything in its power to stop people ending up homeless, particularly children. We passed a referendum on Children First, saying that it is essentially a form of abuse and neglect for people not to have that sort of security of the roof over their head, and yet we have thousands of children and thousands more will end up in this traumatic, cruel, inhumane situation unless the default position of the government is to stop people going into homelessness. And of course, that is not the entire solution. It is a stopgap. It is a band-aid to prevent a disaster from turning into a catastrophe. But what we need, while that is being done, and we made it absolutely clear, we need to accelerate the delivery of public and affordable housing. We need to do something about the absolute scandal of property and land sitting vacant or derelict, not being used. I mean, some people go on about planning permission here. I just have produced a report. 75,000 planning permissions over the last few years, but only 5,000 delivery per year because they're sitting on planning permissions, watching the value of their assets go up. Do something about that, we might get some movement on the housing crisis.
Thank you very much for that contribution. We're way over time.